Hey there. Welcome to the Dreamland Podcast. Every year we see reported a survey of drug use among teenagers, specifically eighth graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders. This has been going on since 1975. I've been hearing about these annual surveys for years. Honestly, I usually kind of take a brief note, then move on, don't pay a whole lot of attention to them. Lately, though, the findings have been remarkable. To talk about what those findings are, I'm happy to welcome to the Dreamland Podcast Dr. Richard Miech. Dr. Miech is a public health sociologist at the University of Michigan. More specifically, he is the leader of the team that runs these surveys. Dr. Richard Miech, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. Let's jump right into it. This survey asks kids to report on their own drug use anonymously, of course. I was hoping you could tell us what it's shown over the last several years.
Yeah, well, thank you for your interest. What has been remarkable is that we've seen a substantial and dramatic decline in almost all drugs, particularly for the top three drugs, which among adolescents, that's alcohol, that's marijuana, and that's vaping nicotine now. That just joined the group as of around 2019. That's a newcomer. But for all three of those, we saw substantial declines during the pandemic, so in 2020 and 2021. And what was kind of surprising is that in our most recent survey in 2024, we find that those declines that occurred during the pandemic, not only have they persisted, but they've continued. And so today, the levels of alcohol, vaping, and marijuana use are even lower than they were in the years during the pandemic. So that to me was kind of a surprise that this decline has continued.
This is not something you've seen during the survey in the decades past, this kind of drop and then sustained drop.
Well, that's an excellent question. So it depends on the substance. You look at marijuana, for example, and it's hovered, the prevalence of use among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, it's hovered within a very tight window, just like 3 or 4 percentage points. That is until the pandemic came, and all of a sudden it drops to the lowest level it's dropped in 25 years. Wow. So to answer your question, yeah, so for marijuana, or cannabis, as people call it today, we've seen this drop is very unique. For alcohol, there's been a steady decline for about, 30 years. It's been going down, 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 but that decline accelerated during the pandemic. And with vaping, that's also, that actually skyrocketed from 2017 to 2020. And then after the pandemic, then it's been going down. And so it really varies on which drug you're talking about.
So I guess the question is why is that? And how much does it have to do with the singular event of COVID, the pandemic? And how much does that have to do with other factors, if you can speak to that?
Yeah, well, that is the million-dollar question. Why?
Okay.
Why do you think, Sam? Why do you think it's gone down? I'll put the question back to you.
I would say it seems to me two things. COVID got people away from the influences that would normally create substance use, that start you in substance use. And fentanyl and methamphetamine are nationwide. And the headlines are not jokes. There are people dying all the time. And maybe that had something to do with it. On the other hand, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was because, we also have a whole bunch of reasons why it might go up. Where legalized marijuana since 2000, early to the teens, 2013, 14, 16 in California and so on. And more and more what I would consider to be, at the very least, problem dependence creating legal substances and sort of gambling, hyperpotent marijuana, all these kinds of things. So I had lots of questions and lots of theories, but just thought I'd run them by you.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot to unpack in your response there. I'll start with some of it. And so, yes, I agree with you that during the pandemic, the social distancing policies were specifically designed to limit social interactions of adolescents, basically to their immediate family. And drug use is a social event, particularly for adolescents. There's not a lot of kids who are going to go out and start using marijuana on their own by themselves in their room
Right.
without their parents.
Sure.
And the school shut down, as we all remember. And there's a lot of risk factors for drug use at school. There's peer pressure, there's sources of drugs that you wouldn't have otherwise. And also during the pandemic, there were very few parties among adolescents because that was prohibited, these social
Where are
gatherings.
the parties? The
Yeah,
answer was, we don't know. There aren't any.
right. So yes. So these kids were stuck at home, and many of them were stuck at home with their parents. It'd be very hard to use marijuana or to start vaping with your parents right there. So that was expected that during the years of the social distancing policies in 2020 and 2021, you would expect that drug use would go down, and that's what we found. And what was a little more unexpected was that the trend would continue afterwards. And so I would love to be able to say I predicted that it would continue afterwards, but I didn't. So I can sit here and I can speculate why it went down, but I did not expect that going into it for the most part. And it could be the fact that there is evidence that if you can delay substance use among adolescents for 1 year, that can have an impact that's lasting for many years and perhaps even for the lifetime of that adolescence in terms of reducing their substance use outcomes, right? They're the levels of substance use. And the idea is that, particularly in ninth grade is when most people start high school, and you start, and you're in a whole new social environment. You want to be a grown up, you want to be like the older kids. And so you're likely to experience peer pressure and what have you. And if that ninth grade was interrupted, then it turns out that you're probably less likely to make friends with a peer group that encourages drug use, because there are those peer groups out there, as we all know. And the if that delay prevents you from meeting up with these groups that are going to encourage you to drug use, there's also biological processes that are at work. So if you take nicotine and you use nicotine when you're an adolescent, it has much more of an effect on your brain than if you use it when you're in your 30s. I've read stories about this is anecdotal, right, in magazines about people who want to get addicted to cigarettes at age 30. They never smoked before, and they try and they can't. It's
Right.
hard as hard as they can. So there's something about using drugs when you're young, when your brain is still developing, that seems to prime your brain to want to use drugs more once you've done that. So if you can delay kids from using drugs for a year, it seems like from what we're seeing now, that is going to have a lifelong impact on those kids. And at the societal level too, there's less drug use we're seeing in the high school. So that would also mean there's less peer pressure that these kids are experiencing as they enter ninth grade and continue on through high school. So those are some issues that are probably at play.
Do you have any thoughts on whether this might continue once that group makes its way, matriculates, and it's a whole different group of kids?
Ask me again in December. We release our findings every December, and I'll let you know. So I guess I'm shy about predicting because I predicted that levels would go back up, right? They're not in school, they're not exposed to all these risk factors. And once I go back to school, then it would seem logical, right, that drug use would go back up to where it was. But that's not what happened.
Do you think, have you any thoughts on whether the headlines surrounding fentanyl and meth and homelessness and this kind of thing, and maybe even not just headlines, but people actually seeing this in their own daily lives, kids in their own daily lives, had maybe a deterrent effect as well? Any
I
thoughts?
definitely think that's a possibility. Yes, kind of the vicarious experiences, right, that you hear about these unfortunate examples. And those can have a very big impact. So maybe you're as old as I am, and you might remember Len Bias. He was a basketball player, and he was number one in the NBA draft, I believe. And before he ever played in the NBA, he was playing basketball. He had done cocaine, and he died of a heart attack on a basketball court. And let me tell you, cocaine use prevalence went way down after that. It had a very big impact. This story that had an impact on people, and cocaine use never really recovered after that.
Is that
So,
so? I did not realize the Lynn bias effect was so profound. I remember it.
oh, yes, right. It's a classic in the field. That is a real big example of how cultural change can lead to changes and decreases in drug use for the most part. So that could be going on as well. that being said, I think there's something else in addition to the stories of fentanyl and the other stories that are out there, because you see these trends in alcohol and you see these trends in vaping, and these are commercially available. It's unlikely that if you're using alcohol, there's going to be fentanyl put into it, unlike, say, marijuana or some of the harder drugs, right?
Right.
So those are also decreasing. So it would be attributing a lot to adolescents, to their thought process that I'm afraid of fentanyl, so I'm not going to use alcohol because that might lead me on a chain of events where I start using harder drugs. I don't think adolescents think like that, right? So
No,
I think that fentanyl, I think that is a factor in there, in addition to these other factors that are at play.
I see. One of the things that strikes me is it would seem to be contradictory given the rise in mental health issues that we've seen reported around the country. A lot of this, I guess, due to COVID and so on, but maybe also social media, et cetera. And generally, depression and so on, anxiety is associated with turning to drugs for some kind of relief.
Right.
I guess, and I was wondering if what you thought about that, it seemed to not fit in that, and as well the spread of very, very potent marijuana and of THC vapes and all the rest. It would I don't know, seem to me that you would have more drug use.
With the idea being that kids are not self-medicating, is that right? That
Something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's we don't really ask in detail much in our survey about mental health questions, because that would be a whole survey in itself to do that correctly and to get into that. I do know that the trends in increasing adolescent mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, that goes back to about 2010. So that goes back to before the pandemic. So it may be that
Cell
those
phone,
two things,
smartphone.
yeah, maybe the smartphone, right? Yeah,
Yes,
the social
that's
media. Yeah,
really
these comparing yourself to everybody else who's having a wonderful time on social media, right? So it may be that it's just they're both happening at the same time. I don't know that there's a tight connection, but that's an excellent research question to look into.
okay. Well, let me know if you get at it. A couple of things that struck me too, and looking at past studies that you have done or been associated with, is it seems to me to conclude that supply early on in life, a supply of drugs, access to drugs early on in life, has a powerful repercussions later on for drug abuse. There's one study that showed, I think you guys found, the legitimate opioid use is associated, legitimate prescribed opioid narcotic painkiller use is associated with increased risk of long-term opioid use and possibly misuse. Also, college, I thought this was an interesting study. College as a risk factor for marijuana initiation increased significantly since 2013, which is kind of about the time when you began to see states legalize marijuana and so on. And you see it really increase in marijuana, the amount of people, kids reporting that they began using marijuana in college, I guess. I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about, from what you have studied, about access to supply and the importance of that in later problems of drug use early on, and the later problems of drug use among teenagers and men into early adult.
Yeah, well, so I think it depends on the drug, which we find a lot. So that study you mentioned where we showed that adolescent use of opioids early in life predicts later use of opioids and misuse of opioids later in life.
Yeah.
That's a supply issue. That's also a use issue, right? So they had the supply and they also used it, and so they might have uh, developed a taste for it. So that's definitely something that I think is amenable to policy changes, that we should try to avoid using opioids with younger adolescents if we can. We can't always do that, right? In terms of supply for marijuana, so that's an interesting case. I looked a lot at that among adolescents. And so Right now, about half of the states have legalized recreational marijuana use, and the other half have not. And as you
Right.
said, that goes back to about 2012, 2014. I think Colorado was the first, and then California and the other states kind of, fell onto that bandwagon. And so, unfortunately, I'm not looking very good here. I expected, well, adolescent marijuana use is going to go up as more and more states legalize recreational use. But that's not what happened. I guess that's why we do this research. If anything, it just held steady, as I mentioned earlier, that since 2020, until the pandemic, marijuana use, at least among adolescents, or college students is another story. But among adolescents, it pretty much stayed steady, which again was surprising to me. And that being said, we asked kids, is it easy for you to get marijuana if you wanted to get it? And our study among 12th graders goes back to 1975. So we've done a nationally representative study every single year, uninterrupted since 1975. And more than 75% of adolescents report that they could get marijuana if they wanted to, going back to 1975, even before recreational use was legalized.
Mm.
So this idea that maybe recreational use would flood the streets with marijuana and lead to greater use among adolescents. Well, it turns out the streets already were flooded with marijuana. People could get it easily, right? So in terms of supply, it really wasn't so much supply, I think, that was driving these kids. It was more demand. Were they interested in it? And the recreational use laws might have increased demand, and the adolescents might see marijuana as an aspirin now, right? Or something legitimate that they could use.
Right. Yeah.
But, and maybe they do, but use hasn't gone up. In fact, since the pandemic, it's gone down. So supply side policies, as we know, typically have not been very successful in reducing at least adolescent drug use because kids, you can try to crack down on supply of marijuana coming from various countries and internally, from Humboldt County, California. But good luck with that. We haven't had much success. We do seem to have more success on the demand side. And I think that, and by that, I mean, getting kids to not want to use the drugs in the first place. And the best example of that is cigarette smoking. So you and I, we can get cigarettes very easily. And cigarettes by adolescents are not difficult to get. You can go to any gas station. But since 1998, when the government passed the Master Tobacco Settlement Agreement of 1998, and again, I'm showing my age here, right? But that penalized the tobacco company $200 billion, which was a lot of money then. It's still a lot of money now. And it increased taxes to reduce the ability of kids to pay for it. And it also led to prohibitions on advertising and also these anti-smoking campaigns. And you and I may not see them that much, but my daughter, when she was an adolescent, she saw them because they were on social media. They were targeted. It was really very clever, It was on TikTok and Instagram and all that kind of stuff where they could really reach specific groups of adolescents. But anyway, my point is that in 1998, about 30% of adolescents reported that they had smoked a cigarette in the past 30 days. And in our most recent survey, I think it's 3%. So it fell tenfold. And even though the supply is pretty much constant during that whole time, the demand, kids have learned that it's not good for them. They don't want to get into it.
But I would push back a little bit on that, though. Isn't it also true, though, we have made it very difficult to smoke. So you can't smoke in bars, can't smoke at the beach parks, can't smoke near 20 feet or 20 yards from a building's opening, and even in winter, you got to be out there in the middle of you can't smoke in airports, can't smoke on airplanes. There's all these places where it may be that you can find the supply, but actually gaining effective access to it, in this case of cigarettes, that seemed to me to be the crucial element that was lacking, particularly bars and places like that. And, I remember when I was starting my career in journalism, I was in a newsroom. Everybody smoked in the newsroom. It was all over. You couldn't avoid it. And I smoked too. And it seemed to me that the cigarette story is one in which we curtailed access to the use. You could buy cigarettes, you just couldn't use them. And you certainly could not use them socially in a way that was acceptable. At a certain point, people would want to be away from you, and smokers, picked up on that as well. It's only all part of this argument I have with myself on these topics about what's more important, supply or demand, and how do you change one or the other. You're right that supply of cigarettes is there. Every 7-Eleven has them, but they're also like $8 a pack. And then where are you going to smoke them? So I don't know. It's these are questions that dawned on me as I was going over what you all had done, what you all had found with your survey. I know you don't like to predict things, and I don't blame you, really. But any thoughts on what you think you might see in the next year or two from this survey, as the eighth graders who spent their eighth grade year in COVID are now graduated out of that, the people you would test?
Yeah, so they are coming into high schools where there are lower levels of drug use, of all drugs, and they're going to experience less peer pressure to use drugs. And so I would expect that this might continue.
Right.
But don't ask me to bet a lot of money on it. I've learned better from my experiences.
Well, that's okay. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been wonderful talking with you. I read this survey and said, damn, how's that possible? I got to get in touch with this guy. So I so appreciate you taking some time to talk. It's been wonderful chatting with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your interest. Good talking with you, Sam.
I've been speaking with Dr. Richard Miech, public health sociologist at the University of Michigan, who runs the annual survey of drug use among adolescents across America. I hope you liked it. Subscribe to my Dreamland newsletter at samquinones.substack.com. See you next time.